It was a rainy night, the kind where the wind whistles through the cracks in the windows and the sky turns into a show of lightning and thunder. I was 13 at the time, and my parents had just started trusting me enough to leave me home alone for the first time overnight. The only rule: don't leave the house and don't bring anyone over. I was excited. It was the perfect chance to play video games with the volume cranked up, without anyone complaining. The storm outside only made things feel cozier. I spent a good while sitting on the porch, watching the sky light up and breathing in the scent of rain in the air. After some time, I decided to take the fun to the next level. I moved my Xbox to the big TV in the living room, the one my dad only let me use when I was home alone. I hooked up the Bose sound system and started playing online with my friend Cody. Everything felt perfect, until in the middle of the game the doorbell rang. It was already past 9, and my parents never used the doorbell when they came home. Deep down, I knew something was off, but out of impulse, I went to the door. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding firmer than I actually felt. A man's voice on the other side answered, "I need to use your phone." My heart raced. I knew I shouldn't open the door. I backed away downstairs without saying another word. But by then, the damage was done. Whoever was outside now knew I was home, and alone. I went back to playing, trying to distract myself. I told Cody on the headset to ignore it, but my mind couldn't stop replaying what had just happened. The doorbell rang again. This time, I didn't move. After a while, the silence returned, and with it, a false sense of safety. Then I heard something, a noise to my right. When I looked over, my blood ran cold. The back door was slowly closing, and stepping into the house was a man, a stranger. I dropped the controller and bolted. I locked myself in the office, heart pounding, trying to think of what to do. The man started knocking on the door, first softly, then harder. "Hey kid, I just need to use the phone. Let me in," he said. But his voice was growing more irritated, more aggressive. The knocking turned into pounding. "Open this door now." I had no choice. I had to get out. I hit the garage door button and slipped under it before it was even fully open. I ran out into the rain, my heart nearly beating out of my chest. I sprinted to my neighbor Julian's house without looking back. When he opened the door and saw me standing there, soaked and out of breath, I could tell something was terribly wrong. We called the police, and when they arrived, they found the man still inside my house. He was completely out of his mind, saying that it was his house and that I was his son. That night forever changed how I viewed the comfort of my own home. I knew the man would be arrested, but the thought that he knew where I lived, that he could come back one day, it haunted me. Storms, which I used to feel safe during, now only brought back the sound of that night of terror. After the police took the man away, I tried to forget. My parents came home, and the following weeks were filled with talks about safety, new locks, cameras. But deep down, I just wanted things to go back to normal. That night, though, something shifted inside me. The comfort I once felt in my own home was gone. Every time a storm started, the feeling of unease returned like a lightning bolt, illuminating the memories of that terrifying night. One early morning, I woke up thirsty. The house was quiet, and for a moment, everything seemed fine. The sound of rain tapping against the window was even kind of soothing. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and headed toward the kitchen. But as soon as I opened the bedroom door, a cold gust hit me. The living room was freezing, way colder than usual. That's when I noticed. The patio door was slightly open. I froze for a second. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself my grandpa must have left it open by accident. But something didn't feel right. I walked over, glanced quickly into the darkness outside, and without thinking too much, shut the door and locked it as fast as I could. I went back to my room, still trying to convince myself everything was fine. I lay in bed, my heart still beating faster than it should have. But something wouldn't let me fully relax. There was an uneasiness, like something was out of place. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard it, a very faint sound coming from under the bed, a soft creaking like springs being compressed. My entire body went stiff. Slowly, I leaned over the side of the bed and peeked underneath. That's when I saw her. She was there, curled up under the bed. A woman, thin, pale, with red eyes and yellow teeth. She was smiling, the kind of smile that makes you feel like something is deeply wrong. Her smile was the most disturbing part of all. It didn't seem human, and before I could process what I was seeing, she let out a laugh. A laugh that seemed to echo straight from the depths of my darkest nightmare. I jumped out of bed, heart racing, and ran for the bedroom door, stumbling over myself in my rush to get out. I sprinted to my grandparents' room, pounding on the door and calling for my grandpa as loudly as I could. He appeared within seconds, and to my surprise, he was armed. I had never seen him with a gun before, and at that moment I was grateful for it. We went back to my room with him in front, gun in hand, and that's when we saw it. The window was open. A white figure, who seemed to be that woman, was disappearing into the darkness of the night. My grandpa fired a shot into the air, a warning, but it was too late. She was gone. We never called the police. There was no evidence, nothing that could be done. But that image, that smile, it never left my mind. Since then, we've put new locks on all the windows and doors in the house, but I know deep down it doesn't matter. It wasn't just the house she invaded that night. She invaded my mind. After that night, I thought I would never truly be able to relax at home again. Even with the new locks and the changes we made, the feeling of safety was never the same. I needed a break from it all. That's why, a few weeks later, when my girlfriend, Cass, suggested a getaway to my family's cabin in the countryside, I figured it would be the perfect distraction. The cabin was small, cozy, in the middle of nowhere, a place that always brought back good memories. Archery, hiking, and quiet nights by the fireplace. The idea of a weekend there, away from everything, seemed like exactly what I needed to clear my head. The first night went well. We made a campfire, told stories, and laughed like the past few weeks never happened. But on the second day, the clouds started to gather. Soon, the storm hit full force. We were sitting on the deck, sheltered under the awning, watching the storm pour down over the forest. It was beautiful, the kind of scene that always relaxed me. Lightning lit up the dark sky, and thunder followed right after, as if the sky itself was shouting. Then I heard it. Among the sounds of the storm, there was something else. A voice. Low, distant, but definitely a human voice. I stood up, trying to see something in the darkness. Cass, already nervous, told me it was probably just the wind, but I said nothing. Deep down, something inside me was on high alert. That sound was strange. Then I saw it. In a flash of lightning, for just a brief moment, a figure appeared at the tree line. I froze, trying to understand what I had just seen. It was a man, standing there, staring in our direction. He wasn't moving, just standing. "There's someone out there," I said to Cass, trying to keep my voice steady. She laughed, thinking I was joking. But when I looked again, he was closer, much closer, just a few meters away from the deck. Panicked, the sight of that man just standing there in the rain, staring at us, was the most disturbing thing I had ever seen. What did he want? Why wasn't he moving or saying anything? Without thinking twice, I went inside the cabin and locked the door. Cass saw the seriousness on my face and started to panic. I tried to calm her down, saying maybe he was just someone looking for shelter from the storm. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Then the noise started. Slow, dragging footsteps across the wooden deck. Even with the storm raging outside, it was clear as day. Cass hid in the bedroom, and I grabbed my dad's rifle from under the bed, my hands shaking as I loaded it. There was no knock at the door, just the sound of something or someone trying to force it open. The silence lasted what felt like an eternity, until suddenly, a face appeared at the kitchen window. I moved closer, trying to steady my breathing, and when I looked more carefully, I saw him. It was him, the man. He was pressed against the window, staring inside with a strange, sinister smile. I didn't hesitate. I opened the front door and stepped outside with the rifle in hand. When he saw me, he froze for a moment, and then, in a panic, I ran outside and fired a shot into the air. It was enough to make him run. And that's when I heard it. There was someone else. More voices, shouting for him from a distance. Their storm of footsteps faded along with the storm, leaving behind only the wind and the feeling that we were no longer alone there. The next morning, we packed up quickly and left the cabin. There were no signs of a break-in, no marks to prove what had happened. But I knew, Cass knew, and since then, I've never returned to the cabin with the same sense of peace. Now, whenever I think about safety, I remind myself that sometimes the worst threats aren't the ones you see coming. They're the storms that appear out of nowhere, in the quietest of times. After that cabin getaway, the feeling of safety seemed distant, almost unreachable. Time passed, and I got used to staying alert, suspicious of every strange sound, whether at home or away. Still, I wasn't prepared for what happened next. A few weeks later, during one of those stormy nights that seemed to haunt me, I woke up to a distant sound, a strange noise. At first, I didn't think much of it. Storms were common this time of year, and I had learned to live with the sound of the wind rattling the windows. But there was something different about that night. The sound wasn't coming from the rain or the wind. It was something else, something that felt much closer. A muffled, repetitive noise. I lay there for a while, trying to convince myself it was just the storm, but the sound persisted. It seemed to be coming from outside the house, but it was hard to tell. I turned on my phone's flashlight and went to the kitchen to grab a glass of water, hoping it would shake off the unease. When I got there, it was like time stopped. The patio door was open again. Not only that, but the cold wind blowing in through the door reminded me of the last time this had happened. My breathing grew heavier and I tried to stay calm. I approached the door, looked outside, but saw no one. I closed and locked the door, repeating in my head that it was just the wind that had pushed the door open. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Not this time. I went back to bed, lay down, but something inside me wouldn't let me relax. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, I felt a soft jolt, a movement coming from under the bed. My skin instantly prickled with fear. I knew what was about to happen, but I couldn't move. It was like my body was frozen with the same terror that had hit me the first time. Slowly, I turned my head, and with the flashlight still on, I looked underneath. She was there, again. The same sickly-looking woman, pale skin, red eyes, yellow teeth. The same sinister laugh, the one that seemed to come from somewhere dark and evil. Her smile, that smile was even more disturbing this time, like she had been waiting for this, like she was toying with me, feeding off my fear. My mind told me to run, but my body wouldn't respond. For a few seconds, all I could do was stare at her, frozen. She was lying there, watching me, as if it were normal for her to be under my bed. Then, I heard something in the hallway, a footstep. Quick, almost imperceptible, but enough to snap me out of the trance I was in. I jumped out of bed and ran into the hallway, stumbling over my own feet, my heart pounding so hard I could barely think straight. I reached my grandparents' bedroom door and started banging on it desperately. My grandfather, with the same readiness as that other night, came out with the gun in hand. We rushed to my room, but this time, she hadn't fled through the window. She was there, standing by the bed, looking at me with that bizarre smile, and for a second my grandfather hesitated. He aimed the gun, but the woman, she just laughed. That laugh I'll never forget. And before anything could happen, she turned and ran. This time, straight through the front door, disappearing into the storm, as if she'd never been there. We stood in silence for long seconds, the sound of the rain filling the emptiness. My grandfather didn't say a word. He just shut the door and locked everything again. The police weren't called this time. It was pointless. They'd never find this woman. She wasn't just an intruder. She was a nightmare, coming to haunt me when I least expected it, when I needed security the most. And that's when I understood something I had never wanted to accept before. There are things locked doors can't keep out. Things that don't belong to our world but somehow find a way in. And when they do, they leave scars that no lock or weapon can erase. Now, every time I hear the sound of a storm approaching, my heart races, and that familiar sense of fear consumes me again. Because I know that somewhere out there, she's waiting for the next opportunity to show up. After that last encounter, the feeling of vulnerability wouldn't leave me. Every time a storm started, I prepared myself, locking doors, windows, and making sure everything was secure. But what I could never lock away was the fear that, at any moment, that woman would come back. And with each passing night, I became more aware that locks wouldn't be enough to keep the danger outside. And then, one night, it happened again. It was a Saturday night, and I was in the living room, trying to distract myself with some random movie, when I heard the sound of something scratching the front door. It wasn't loud, just a soft noise, like nails dragging across the wood. My heart raced instantly, but, like the other times, I tried to stay calm. I went to the door, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, or maybe some animal, nothing more than that. I took a deep breath, looked through the side window, and of course, saw no one. But the scratching continued. I knew something was wrong, but at the same time, part of me hesitated to act. Fear paralyzed me. I stepped away from the door, went back to the living room, and sat down, trying to ignore the sound. Maybe if I pretended not to hear it, it would go away. But the scratching got louder, more persistent, and then a voice came. "Let me in." That voice. It wasn't distant anymore. It wasn't a vague figure at the window. It was real, and it was right there at my door. I froze. Like the last time, my body didn't want to move, but my mind screamed for me to do something. Anything. "I need to come in. Please." The desperation in her voice sounded so human, yet at the same time, something about it was deeply wrong. I knew I couldn't open the door. Not this time. But then, something unexpected happened. Something changed. The scratching stopped, and instead, I heard a heavier sound, like someone trying to force their way in. I ran to my grandparents' bedroom. The same routine as always. Bang on the door, ask for help. But this time, when my grandfather opened the door, something in his eyes made me realize he was scared too. It wasn't just about protecting the house anymore. He knew, somehow, that we were facing something that couldn't be contained. We went back to the living room, but when we looked at the door, it was already open. There was no sign of forced entry, no person nearby. Just the door wide open, swaying slightly in the wind from the storm outside. My grandfather gripped the gun tighter, took a step outside, and I followed, even though every fiber of my being wanted to run in the opposite direction. That's when I saw her again, at the edge of the yard, right at the tree line. She was standing there, staring straight at me, as if she were waiting for something. Her smile. It was the same disturbing smile from before, but now it seemed more determined, like she knew that every time she appeared, I was getting weaker, more tired of fighting. She took a step forward, still smiling, and my grandfather fired a shot into the air. The sound echoed through the night, but she didn't move. She just stood there, as if nothing could scare her, as if the shot was insignificant compared to what she was. And then, she said something I'll never forget. "You can't keep me out forever." Those words stuck in my mind as I watched her disappear once again into the darkness. The front door remained wide open, like a cruel reminder that she didn't need to force her way in. She had already found a way into my life, into my mind. No matter how hard I tried to keep her out, she would always find a way in. Now, every time I close my eyes, every time a storm approaches, I know she's out there, waiting for the right moment to come back. And the truth is, deep down, I know she's right. I can't keep her out forever. I remember that night felt like any other. It was one of those nights when the storm outside battered the windows hard. I had always liked that kind of weather. The sound of rain was almost comforting. What I didn't know was that on that night, in particular, something was about to change the way I would face the place where I lived forever. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, with nothing important on my mind. It was past midnight, and I knew I should have been trying to sleep, but the storm kept me awake. The sound of the wind and rain was almost hypnotizing. Every lightning strike lit up the room for a few seconds, and the thunder that followed made the whole house shake. But none of that bothered me until the power went out. When the lights suddenly went off, my heart raced for a second. But then I remembered that in storms like this, it happened all the time. Nothing unusual. I had my phone, it had battery, so I just kept doing what I was doing. But after a while, I finally started to feel tired. I set my phone aside and closed my eyes, ready to fall asleep. That's when I suddenly felt a thirst. My mouth was completely dry, like I hadn't drunk water for hours. Couldn't ignore it. I sat up in bed, grabbed my phone again, and turned on the flashlight to light my way to the kitchen. The house was cold, colder than usual. When I opened my bedroom door, a blast of cold air hit me. At first, I figured it was just the house cooling down because of the storm. But when I got to the kitchen, I realized what was really happening. The patio door was open, not just unlocked, wide open enough for the wind to blow in and freeze the room. I stood there, staring into the darkness outside. I tried to rationalize, telling myself that someone in the house must have left it open, but deep down, I knew it didn't make sense. I quickly shut the door and locked it. The click of the lock was a small comfort. I went back to my room, trying not to think too much about it. I just wanted to lie down, drink my water, and sleep. I tried to ignore the growing unease, that feeling that something was out of place. But it was as if, somehow, I knew I wasn't alone. I lay back in bed, turned on my phone's flashlight, and left it beside me, like a makeshift nightlight, just to feel a bit safer. I closed my eyes, trying to relax. But then I heard it. It was a soft, almost imperceptible sound, coming from under the bed. A creak, like something shifting down there. My whole body froze instantly. Every instinct told me not to look, but at the same time, I couldn't just ignore it. Slowly, I leaned over the side of the bed and, with the flashlight still on, I looked underneath. That's when I saw her. She was there, a woman curled up under my bed. Thin, with pale skin, red eyes staring directly at me, and a smile. That smile. I had never seen anything like it before. A wide, disturbing smile that seemed inhuman. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stayed there, watching me, like she was waiting for something. For a few seconds, I was paralyzed. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I was going to pass out. And then she laughed. A low, raspy laugh, as if it came from the depths of a damaged throat. A laugh that seemed to mock my fear. I didn't think twice. I jumped out of bed and ran to the door, locking it behind me as if that would keep her out. The sound of my heartbeat echoed in my ears, and my legs felt like rubber as I sprinted down the hallway to my grandparents' room. I pounded on the door, waiting for my grandpa. When he opened it, I saw the alarm in his eyes. Without me saying anything, he knew something was terribly wrong. He grabbed the gun he kept stored away and went straight to my room. I followed, my heart still racing, and when we got there, the window was open. She was gone. My grandpa leaned out of the window, gun in hand, but outside, all that remained was the darkness and the sound of rain tapping against the glass. There was no sign of her, no clue as to how she had come or gone. But I knew it wasn't my imagination. I knew what I had seen. From that day on, we made sure to lock every window and door with extra care. But deep down, I knew it didn't matter how many locks we put in place, because what was under my bed that night wasn't something locks could keep out. After that night, nothing felt the same. Even with the locks and precautions we took, the feeling that something was always waiting to get me never left. I avoided my room, always finding excuses to stay in the living room or kitchen. During the day, I could almost convince myself that everything was fine, that maybe it had just been a strange nightmare, the result of my overactive imagination. But when night fell and silence took over the house, the memory of that woman under the bed came rushing back with full force. A few weeks passed. I was starting to believe that it would never happen again. The storms continued, as always, but nothing out of the ordinary. It was a particularly quiet night, despite the rain outside, when I felt that same strange sensation again. This time, there was no initial noise. Nothing unusual, just the unease inside me, like my body knew something was wrong before my mind could catch up. I was lying in bed, and once again, thirst drove me to get up. I went to the kitchen, turned on the lights, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. I grabbed a glass of water, took a long sip, and started heading back to my room slowly. But before I even reached the door, something made me stop. A chill ran down my spine, and one question formed in my mind. Did I check the patio door? With a tight feeling in my chest, I walked back to the living room, only to see what I feared most. The patio door, once again, was open. This time, there was no excuse. No one else had been here, and I was certain I had locked it earlier. I stood there, staring at the wind making the curtains sway and the rain lightly splashing on the floor, unable to move for a few seconds. I forced myself to walk over and close the door again, locking it with a loud click and securing it even more firmly this time. But the relief never came. Something inside me told me that closing the door wasn't enough. Something was already inside the house. I went back to my room, trying to ignore the growing feeling that I wasn't alone. I lay down on my bed, but this time I couldn't relax. The memory of that night, of the woman under the bed, felt even more real now. Why was the door open again? Could she be back? Then I felt it, the same slight jolt as before. A subtle noise, the creak of springs, like something or someone was moving beneath the bed. I closed my eyes for a second, praying that it was just my imagination. But the sound continued, a faint scraping, so quiet I could barely believe it was real. But it was. My body froze, as if it instinctively knew that looking down again would be the worst decision I could make. But at the same time, I needed to confirm it. I had to know. With a trembling hand, I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and slowly, very slowly, leaned over the side of the bed. She was there, the same woman, pale, thin, with those red eyes and that unsettling smile that seemed to stretch even wider this time. She didn't move, just stared at me, as if waiting for me to react. And when our eyes met, that same laugh returned. A raspy, slow, and malicious laugh that made my stomach turn. This time I couldn't move. I wanted to run, scream, do something, anything, but my body wouldn't respond. It was as if her presence had locked me in place, preventing me from making any movement. I was at her mercy, and she knew it. She kept laughing softly, as if she was enjoying my despair. Then, slowly, with a nearly calculated movement, she started to crawl forward, coming out from under the bed, like she was preparing to do what? I didn't know, but the thought of staying to find out was too terrifying. At the last second, my body finally responded. I jumped out of bed, stumbling toward the door. I ran down the hallway, almost knocking everything over in my path, and banged on my grandparents' door again, begging for my grandfather to open it quickly. When he finally did, I rushed inside, unable to fully explain what had just happened. This time, my grandfather didn't hesitate. He grabbed the gun, and together we returned to my room. But, as before, she had already disappeared. The window was open again, and the wind gently blew the curtain as if nothing had happened. But we both knew she had returned, and the worst part was the certainty that she would come back again. Somehow, she was hunting me. It didn't matter how many doors I locked or how many windows were secured. That woman, that thing, would always find a way back. And now, every time I hear the sound of a window opening or a soft creak from under the bed, my whole body braces for the inevitable. She would always come back. And this time, I knew I couldn't run forever. After that second encounter, I started living in a constant state of alert. Every night was a battle against the fear, a struggle with my own mind, which insisted on reminding me of every disturbing detail. I barely slept, always with my phone's flashlight next to me, as if the light could protect me from something that clearly didn't belong to this world. The weeks passed, and little by little, I tried to return to some sense of normalcy. My grandparents knew something was wrong, but how could I explain it? How could I tell them that a woman, or whatever it was, appeared under my bed, smiling that sickly smile? Even to me, it seemed impossible. It was during one of those nights, when I was trying once again to have a normal night of sleep, that everything changed again. I was lying in bed, with my phone's flashlight already on beside me, trying to find some peace. The house was quiet, and for the first time in a while there wasn't a storm outside. Just the heavy silence, the kind that made every little sound echo almost unbearably. And it was in that silence that I heard it. It wasn't a new sound. It wasn't the soft creaking of the springs under the bed. It was something more subtle, more distant, but it made my heart race. It was the sound of a door opening. Slowly, I got out of bed, my whole body tense. I grabbed the flashlight and left my room, trying not to make any noise. The house was dark, but the sound was unmistakable. It was coming from the living room. Each step I took was accompanied by a growing fear, the certainty that something terrible was about to happen. When I reached the living room, I saw it, the patio door open again. But this time something was different. The air coming through the door was colder, heavier, as if the entire atmosphere had changed. The chill that took over wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, a fear that came from a primal place. I carefully closed the door, locking it once more. But as I turned to head back to my room, I heard the sound I had never wanted to hear again. The faint scraping from my room, the unmistakable sound of something or someone moving under the bed. My heart sank. I knew she was there. I knew that if I looked, I would find her with that same unsettling smile. But this time, something inside me felt different. It wasn't just fear. It was as if I knew this would never stop. She would always come back as long as I kept running. With the flashlight still in my hand, I walked back to my room. Each step felt heavier than the last. When I reached the door, I hesitated. But I knew I had to do this. I knew, somehow, that I had to face it again. I entered the room and went straight to the bed. The silence was suffocating. I sat on the edge, feeling the cold creeping up my spine. And then, finally, I slowly leaned over the side, pointing the flashlight underneath. And there she was, the same woman, thin and pale, with red eyes fixed on me, as if she had been waiting for this moment. But this time, there was something more in her smile. It wasn't just unsettling, it was challenging. As if she knew that with every time she appeared, I was breaking a little more. "You know you can't hide forever," she said. Her voice was low, raspy, but it carried a terrifying clarity. Those words echoed in my mind, hanging in the air between us. I couldn't respond. My body was frozen, and all I could do was stare at her. And then, slowly, she started to crawl out from under the bed, as if she intended to fully emerge this time. That's when the panic hit me again. Without thinking, I jumped up and ran. This time straight out of the room, slamming the door behind me as if that could keep her out. But deep down, I knew locking doors wouldn't help anymore. I knew she would always find a way back. My grandparents came running, asking what had happened, but the words wouldn't come out. How could I explain to them what I was going through? How could I make someone believe that a woman was crawling out from under my bed, haunting me with words and smiles that didn't belong in this world? This time, I didn't go back to the room. I stayed awake in the living room until dawn, with the sense that at any moment, she could appear again. I knew it didn't matter where I was in the house. She would always be near. She would always find a way to remind me that the fear I felt wasn't unfounded. She was hunting me, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep running. After that night, the reality of the situation started to weigh even more heavily. It was as if every corner of the house had been contaminated by her presence. I avoided my room at all costs, but deep down, I knew it didn't matter. She didn't need a reason to show up. She just came whenever she wanted, like she was playing some kind of twisted game with me. I began sleeping on the couch in the living room, or at least I tried to. With every sound, every distant noise, my body would tense up, bracing for her. My nights were long, and the exhaustion took over me. It was a mental and physical fatigue, but there was no escaping the constant fear. Then came another night, a night different from the others. Everything was silent. No storm this time, no wind howling through the windows. But the silence was more terrifying than anything else could have been. I was lying on the couch trying to convince myself that maybe, just maybe, this night would be different, that she might not show up. But deep down, I knew it was a lie I was telling myself. It was past 2 in the morning when I heard it again. That sound. It wasn't the creaking of the springs under the bed this time. It was louder, a soft scraping sound, like someone was dragging their nails along the wall or the floor. I didn't need to think long to understand what it was. She was there somewhere in the house. Close. I sat up, my heart racing, scanning the living room. I knew that at any moment I might see her, standing there with that smile that seemed to feed off my fear. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and stood still for a few seconds, listening. Then it changed. Footsteps, slow, coming from the hallway that led to my room. I knew she was getting closer, but part of me needed to confirm it, as if a part of me needed to face her once and for all. I got up from the couch, hesitant, and walked toward the hallway, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I reached the door to my room, and of course it was open, just like always. Inside, the darkness seemed thicker, heavier. I swallowed hard, and with the flashlight pointed at the doorway, I took a step forward. I knew she would be there, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw next. She wasn't under the bed this time. She wasn't hiding. She was standing in the middle of the room, looking directly at me. The light from the flashlight illuminated her pale face, the red eyes glowing in the darkness, and that smile, that cursed smile that never changed, as if it were frozen on her face. "Do you still think you can hide from me?" Her voice was low, raspy, but it carried a terrifying certainty. This time, she wasn't laughing. It wasn't a veiled threat, it was a statement. I stood there, paralyzed, unable to think of a response. She took a step forward, each movement slow, deliberate, as if she was savoring my fear. I stepped back, stumbling over the doorframe, but even then, I couldn't look away. "You know this won't end, don't you?" She took another step. "It doesn't matter where you go. It doesn't matter what you do. I will always be here." I couldn't respond. Terror gripped me in a way I had never felt before. It wasn't just fear of her presence anymore. It was the absolute despair of knowing that this would never end. She was breaking me, a little more each time she appeared, and I was starting to accept that maybe she was right. Then, without warning, she simply turned around. She walked to the window with that same eerie calmness and opened it. The night wind blew into the room, rustling the curtains. She paused for a moment, her back to me, and then, without looking back, she said one last thing. "I'll be back when you least expect it." And then, just like the first time, she was gone. She disappeared through the window, vanishing into the darkness of the night. I stood there, staring at the empty space where she had been. The room looked the same as it always had, as if nothing had happened. But I knew that it was just another warning, another reminder that she was in control. I shut the window with trembling hands and went back to the living room, trying to catch my breath. With each encounter, it felt like she was pushing me further to the edge, playing with my mind in ways I didn't know how to handle. And the worst part was the uncertainty. I never knew when she would show up again, but I knew that, somehow, she always would. That night, I finally understood the most terrifying truth of all. This wasn't something I could stop. It wasn't something I could solve. She wasn't just an intruder in my room. She was an intruder in my mind, and each time she appeared, she dug her claws deeper into my fear. Now, the simple act of sleeping had become a battlefield, and I didn't know how much longer I could hold out. After that night, the terror wasn't confined to the darkness or to my room anymore. It settled inside me, in every corner of the house, in every moment of silence. It was as if, at any second, I might hear her again, feel her presence approaching. Every shadow, every noise, seemed to signal her return. And the worst part was knowing that she enjoyed it. She liked seeing me on the edge, waiting, always on the brink of panic. I stopped trying to fight. I slept less and less, always on the couch, with all the lights on and my phone's flashlight beside me. But even the light, which once felt like a shield against the fear, began to lose its power. She would return, whether from under the bed or standing in the middle of the room. No matter how much I tried to prepare myself, the truth was simple. There was no escape. And then, it happened again. It was an eerily calm night. No storm, no wind, just the deep silence that always preceded her arrival. I was sitting on the couch, phone in hand, trying to distract my mind with anything that could take me away from the thought that, at any moment, she could appear. But, of course, the silence broke. It always did. It started with that familiar sound, the soft scraping, like nails dragging across wood. But this time, it wasn't coming from under the bed or the hallway. It was coming from the front door. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and walked toward the door. My phone's flashlight was on, but somehow the light seemed weak, unable to penetrate the darkness that was starting to surround the house. When I reached the door, I heard her voice. Low, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. "Let me in." I froze. It was as if those words had the power to trap me in place, to steal away any resolve I might have had. She had never spoken like this before. There had never been a request to come inside. "Let me in, please." Her voice sounded different this time, almost pleading. But I knew it wasn't a genuine plea. I knew this was part of her game. She wanted me to come closer. She wanted me to open the door. I took a deep breath, trying to stay in control. But the truth is, by that moment, fear had already taken over. My entire body trembled as I took a step back. And then, something changed. It wasn't just the soft scratching anymore. Now, it sounded like something heavy was being thrown against the door. A dull, repeated thud. She was trying to get in. "Let me in." Her voice grew louder, more desperate, and at the same time, filled with a simmering rage. As if, behind the plea, there was something far darker waiting to be unleashed. "You can't keep me out forever." I took another step back, unsure of what to do. Locking the door seemed pointless. She had entered so many times, in so many ways, and now it felt like she was tired of waiting. She wanted to end the game. The pounding on the door became more violent, more insistent, until, in a final act of desperation, I ran to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and rushed back to the living room. But the door was open. I knew I hadn't opened it. I hadn't touched the handle, hadn't unlocked anything. But there it was, wide open like a portal into the void. A cold wind swept into the house, and with it, the certainty that she was there. My breath caught in my throat. I knew what was coming. I knew that, at any moment, she would appear. I waited. The knife in my hand felt useless, like a toy in my shaking hands. And then, there she was. Her figure emerged from the darkness outside, moving slowly into the house, as if she knew I had nowhere to run. She didn't need to hurry, didn't need to rush. Every step was a reminder that I wasn't in control. Or worse yet, she was in control of me. She stopped in the middle of the living room, with that smile I knew so well, her red eyes glowing in the dark, as if she was enjoying what she saw. I couldn't move a muscle. I just stood there, staring at her, as fear gripped every part of my being. "I told you, you couldn't keep me out." Her voice was almost calm now, as if the anger had passed. She knew she had won. She knew that no matter what I did, I would never truly be safe. Then, she took a step forward, and another, until she was just a few feet away from me. I didn't try to react. There was no more fight left in me, just the certainty that the game was over. "I will always be here. Always." She moved even closer, so near that I could feel the cold radiating from her, that stench of rot and decay that surrounded her. And then, just like before, she turned. She walked slowly toward the open door, and without another word, disappeared into the night. I stood there, with the useless knife in my hand, staring at the open door. I knew that, this time, she didn't need to force her way in. She was already inside me. She had made her presence known in my mind and in my heart. Now, even when the house is quiet, even when the door is locked, I know she never really left. She's always waiting, biding her time, ready to return. And no matter how hard I try, no matter how many lights I leave on or how many locks I put on the doors, she will always find a way in. Because in the end, what she wants is to remind me that the fear I feel will never go away. The cabin in the middle of nowhere had always been a refuge for me. It was the kind of place my family used to escape the rush of life, a peaceful spot where the only distractions were the stars above and the sounds of nature around us. When I decided to take my girlfriend, Cass, there for a weekend getaway, I thought it would be perfect. A little peace, a break from the world, and maybe even some outdoor adventure. The cabin itself was simple, small, rustic, but comfortable. It had running water, electricity, and just enough to cook a decent meal. It was the kind of place that made you feel at home, even though you knew you were completely isolated from everything. The first night went well. We had a simple dinner, watched an old movie on the DVD player that still worked, and then sat on the deck admiring the night sky. I always thought the stars shone brighter up there, far from the city lights, and in that moment with Cass by my side, everything felt perfect. But on the second day, the clouds started to gather. The air grew heavier, and it was clear a storm was coming. I figured it would be a quick summer shower, so we gathered our things and prepared for a quiet evening inside the cabin. The sound of rain on the roof was relaxing at first. We put on another movie, made dinner, and listened to the thunder rumbling in the distance, growing louder with each passing minute. It was during that storm that something strange happened. Cass and I were on the deck, enjoying the spectacle of nature, lightning illuminating the sky, the sound of thunder reverberating all around. But in the middle of all that chaos, I heard something different. It wasn't the wind or the sound of the trees swaying. It was a voice. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on us. But then I heard it again. A distant voice, almost impossible to make out in the storm, but definitely human. I stood up, trying to see something through the heavy rain. I moved closer to the edge of the deck, letting a few drops hit me as I squinted toward the tree line. And then, in a flash of lightning, I saw him. For just a second, I made out the figure of a man. He was standing at the edge of the forest, facing us. I froze. I didn't know who he was or what he was doing there, but every instinct told me something was wrong. "Cass, there's someone out there," I said, trying to stay calm. She laughed, thinking I was joking, but when she saw my face, she realized I was serious. I didn't want to scare her more than necessary, so I suggested we head back inside. But inside, I was starting to feel uneasy. I shut the deck door behind us and locked it. Cass asked what I thought it was, but I had no answer. Maybe it was just a lost hiker, someone seeking shelter from the storm. But why hadn't he moved? Why was he just standing there in the rain? We tried to relax, go back to the movie, but we couldn't shake the image of that figure standing at the edge of the woods. I listened closely to every sound outside, every tap of rain against the cabin. Then, in the tense silence between thunderclaps, we heard footsteps. This time, they weren't distant. They were close, heavy, almost dragging footsteps, as if someone was circling the cabin, testing its walls. My heart raced and I glanced at Cass. She was frozen, fear clearly written across her face. I stood up, trying to figure out what to do. The cabin didn't have a doorbell, so the next sound we expected to hear was a knock at the door. But instead, what came was something far more sinister. A soft scraping on the wood, like someone trying to open the door, but without knocking. I ran to the window, turned off the lights, and peered outside. In the darkness, with the rain still pouring down hard, I saw the silhouette of a person. Much closer now. He was standing just a few meters from the front door, completely still. A flash of lightning revealed his face. Pale, almost expressionless, but his eyes. Those eyes were locked on the cabin, as if they were staring straight through it. "There's someone out there," I said again, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "He's trying to get in." Cass grabbed my arm, unsure of what to do. I didn't want her to panic, so I whispered that maybe he just needed help, but every fiber of my being knew that wasn't the case. Something was wrong. That person, that man, he wasn't there by accident. I grabbed the rifle my dad kept stored in the cabin. I had never used a gun before, but at that moment I didn't care. I loaded it, trying to keep my hands steady, and waited. The footsteps on the deck stopped suddenly. There was no knock, no attempt to speak. Just silence. mixed with the sound of the storm outside. When I approached the front door and opened a small crack, aiming the rifle through the opening, there was no one there. Only the empty night. But I knew he was still out there. The silence that followed was unbearable. The rain still pounded hard on the roof, and the thunder continued to roar. But now, those sounds felt insignificant compared to what was happening outside. I stood there at the door, gripping the rifle tightly, but there was no sign of the man. Still, I knew he hadn't left. It was as if the darkness around the cabin had swallowed him up, hiding him, but not taking him away. Cass stood behind me, breathing fast and nervously. I knew she was scared, and I was trying to keep my own fear in check, but the sense of being trapped was overwhelming. I slowly shut the door, trying not to make a sound, and turned to her. "We'll stay inside, okay?" My voice came out calmer than I felt. "He's not getting in." Cass nodded, but her eyes were wide with fear. She tried to speak, but no words came out. She didn't need to. We both knew that even though the doors were locked, it didn't mean we were safe. I walked to the window, the same one where I had first seen the man. It was still raining hard, and the outside light was weak, but I looked again, and there he was, standing again. He was closer this time, just a few feet from the cabin, almost at the edge of the deck. His face was clearer now, pale and expressionless. His eyes locked on the window, as if he knew I was there, watching him. He didn't move, didn't say anything. He just stared. My heart raced. Every instinct told me to do something, yell, run, anything, but my body was frozen. There was something deeply unsettling in the way he looked at us, as if he was waiting. But waiting for what? "He's closer," I whispered to Cass, without taking my eyes off the figure outside. "Oh my God!" Her voice trembled, and I knew panic was setting in. What does he want? I had no answer. My mind was racing, trying to find a solution, but all I could think was that something was terribly wrong with that man. It was as if he was playing a game with us, a game I didn't understand. Suddenly, the sound returned. It wasn't the footsteps on the deck this time, nor the scratching at the door. It was more subtle, closer, almost like a whisper, but it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the cabin. Cass looked at me, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, trying to locate the source of the sound. The wind still howled outside, but there was something else. Something that seemed to be moving inside the cabin. I tightened my grip on the rifle and began walking toward the hallway that led to the bedroom. Cass followed closely behind, her footsteps almost silent. Every movement I made seemed to echo through the cabin, the creaking of the wood beneath my feet barely audible over my own breathing. And then I heard it again, a soft scraping sound, like nails being dragged across the wooden floor. It wasn't coming from the bedroom or the living room. It was coming from the kitchen. I turned slowly, and with my phone's flashlight in hand, I pointed it toward the kitchen. There, in the darkest corner of the room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shadow, a slight movement, too fast to identify at first. But it was there. Something or someone was moving inside the cabin. "There's someone in here," I whispered to Cass. She didn't respond, but I felt her grip on my arm tighten. I knew that if someone was inside the cabin, they hadn't come through the door or windows. Everything was locked. So how did they get in? Or worse, what exactly was this thing? With the rifle in hand and the flashlight illuminating the path ahead, I began walking toward the kitchen. Each step felt heavier than the last, the silence broken only by the distant sound of the rain outside and the soft scraping that continued. When I finally reached the entrance to the kitchen, I stopped, holding the flashlight steady and scanning every corner. And then, in the back of the kitchen, I saw it. The pale figure, the same silhouette I had seen outside, was standing there, as if it had been waiting for us the whole time. But this time, it wasn't just watching. It was smiling. A wide, distorted smile that made my stomach turn. "What do you want?" I managed to say, trying to keep the panic out of my voice, but the figure didn't respond. It just kept smiling, that grin growing wider by the second, as if it was feeding off our fear. I didn't know what to do. Every part of me screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. And then, before I could react, the figure moved. Quick, like a shadow crawling across the floor, disappearing into the darkness. Cass let out a small scream, and I ran after the shadow, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I reached the hallway, it was empty. Nothing. No sign of whoever or whatever it was. The cabin fell silent again, but the silence was suffocating, heavy. I knew that whatever it was still nearby, just waiting. We stood there in the quiet, the sound of the rain a distant murmur now. Cass was trembling beside me, and I didn't know what to tell her. All I knew was that we were not alone, and whatever was playing this game with us wasn't done yet. The sense of dread weighed heavily on me, knowing that this was far from over. Whatever was outside, whatever had been inside the cabin, wasn't gone. It was still watching. The hallway was empty, but the air around me felt thicker, as if each breath was being sucked out of the room. Cass stood behind me, and I could hear her rapid, shallow breathing. She could barely speak, and I couldn't blame her. What we had seen, that man or whatever it was, had moved in a way that defied the natural order, like it wasn't bound by the same laws of our world. He disappeared? Cass's voice was barely a whisper. I don't know. The only thing I knew for sure was that we weren't alone in that cabin. I moved back into the living room, still holding the rifle, the flashlight sweeping through the dark corners. Every step I took seemed to echo in the oppressive silence, the creak of the floorboards unnervingly loud. The storm outside had calmed, but the quiet inside the cabin was suffocating. I knew he was still out there. Then I heard it. A new sound, different, came from the kitchen window. It was like someone was outside, scratching the glass with force, but slowly, deliberately, as if to remind us that they were still there, that they hadn't left. Stay behind me, I told Cass, trying not to let the fear take over. With each step, the scratching grew louder, closer. When I finally reached the window, I hesitated for a second, my heart pounding, before raising the flashlight to shine on the glass. And there he was, on the other side of the window, standing in the darkness, the same pale figure, his face pressed against the glass, eyes locked on me. The rain streamed down the window, distorting his form slightly, but there was no mistaking it. It was him. His smile had returned, wider and more twisted than before. But what terrified me wasn't just the sight of him standing there. It was what he did next. He raised his hand slowly and, with one finger, began drawing something on the glass. The sound of his fingers scraping against the window was unbearable, a grating noise that set every nerve in my body on edge. I stood there, frozen, watching as he drew a strange symbol, something I had never seen before. It looked like a circle with jagged lines cutting through it, some kind of mark. When he finished, he stepped back, still smiling, as if waiting for a reaction. I was ready to fire, ready to do anything, but the truth was, I had no idea what I was dealing with. This wasn't just a normal intruder. Whatever this was, it wasn't natural. Cass moved closer, her hand gripping my shoulder, and when I looked at her, I saw the fear in her eyes. What is he doing? Her voice was barely audible. I don't know, I replied. It was the honest truth. I had no idea what was happening. All I knew was that we were being pulled into something we couldn't understand. Suddenly, the man outside seemed to dissolve into the darkness, as if the night itself had swallowed him. The sound of his fingers scratching the glass stopped, and everything went silent again. I approached the window, trying to see beyond the storm, but he was gone. The only thing left behind was that strange symbol scrawled on the window. I didn't know what it meant, but one thing was clear. He wasn't just trying to scare us. He was marking the cabin, marking us. We need to leave, I said to Cass, my heart still racing. Now, she nodded, and together we moved through the cabin, gathering our things as quickly as we could. Every movement felt heavy with the tension of an imminent threat, as if he could appear again at any moment, this time inside the cabin. As we packed, the silence was interrupted by small, unsettling noises. Slow footsteps on the deck, the sound of something scraping against the wood, like he was circling the house again. We made our way to the front door, and I unlocked it, ready to leave, but when I opened it, a gust of cold wind rushed into the cabin. Outside, everything was quiet. The storm had passed, but the darkness surrounding the cabin felt thicker, as if it was waiting for us. Cass looked at me, and I could see the terror in her eyes. But we had no choice. We needed to get out before something worse happened. We started walking toward the car, the flashlight guiding the way, but as we reached the vehicle, we noticed something that made the fear inside me grow even more. The tires were slashed, all 4 of them. I looked at Cass, unsure of what to say. We were trapped. She began to cry softly, the panic finally overwhelming her. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. I had no answer. We stood there, in the middle of the dark, surrounded by the forest. And deep down, I knew he wasn't done with us. We were playing his game, and now we had nowhere to run. At that moment, I realized it wasn't just about leaving the cabin. The real danger was far beyond the wooden walls. The weight of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. We were trapped in the middle of nowhere. No transportation, no neighbors for miles, and something terrifying closing in on us. Cass was crying, and I was doing my best to stay calm. But the truth was, I was completely lost. The man, or whatever he was toying with us, marking his time, surrounding us, and now he had left us without any way to escape. I looked down at the slashed tires. That wasn't a random act. He knew exactly what he was doing, cutting us off even further. But there was no time to panic. We needed a plan. We had to get out of there, somehow. "Let's go back to the cabin," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We can't stay out here." Cass shook her head quickly, tears still in her eyes. "But he's out there. He could be anywhere." "I know, but it's worse out here. At least inside we have doors and windows. We can protect ourselves." She hesitated but finally nodded, and together we made our way back to the cabin. The darkness around us felt alive, pulsing, as if the forest itself was watching. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart race, but we moved as fast as we could. When we reached the door, I slammed it shut and locked it, trying to block out the overwhelming feeling that he was watching us from the woods. The cabin, which had once been a refuge, now felt like a prison. The wooden walls didn't seem strong enough to keep us safe. "Let's go to the bedroom," I suggested. "We'll stick together. At least we can see if anything tries to get in." We headed to the bedroom, and I placed the rifle by the bed, the flashlight within reach. The symbol that the man had drawn on the kitchen window lingered in my mind, a haunting reminder of what we were up against. What did it mean? Were we being marked for something? We sat on the bed, and the silence between us was thick. I tried to think of a solution, but every idea seemed useless. We were cornered, and time was against us. Then we heard it. First, it was a soft thudding against the walls. A subtle sound, like something or someone was scratching the outside of the cabin. Cass looked at me, wide-eyed, and I knew she heard it too. The sound continued, moving as if circling the house. Slow, dragging footsteps on the deck, followed by the scraping of something being dragged across the wooden boards. I grabbed the rifle again, standing up slowly. "Stay here," I whispered to Cass. "I'm going to see what's happening." She clutched my arm, her eyes pleading. "Don't go." I hesitated for a moment but knew we couldn't just sit there, paralyzed by fear. "I have to check." I moved slowly toward the bedroom door, my heart pounding louder with each step. When I reached the living room, I stopped, listening. The scraping sound was still there, but now it seemed closer, more deliberate. I shone the flashlight across the room, and that's when I saw something that chilled me to the core. On the front door, where there had been nothing before, there were deep, jagged scratches, as if someone or something had been clawing at the wood repeatedly. The symbol he had drawn on the kitchen window was now carved into the door. The mark he had left outside was now on our only exit. My breath caught in my throat. He was marking his territory, making it clear there was no escape. No matter where we went, he would always be one step ahead. I returned to the bedroom, my body tense, and sat next to Cass. "He's outside," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "And he's not going to stop." Cass started crying again, and I held her close, not knowing what else to do. The feeling of helplessness was crushing. As much as I wanted to fight, I had no idea how to face this. He wasn't just someone trying to scare us. There was something more, something I couldn't comprehend, something that wasn't human. And then, the thing I feared most happened. The bedroom door handle began to turn. First, a slow twist, almost imperceptible. Then harder, as if someone was trying to open it. I jumped to my feet, gripping the rifle, and stood in front of the door, my heart racing. Cass clung to the bedpost, terror written all over her face. "Stay behind me," I said, not taking my eyes off the door. The handle kept turning, now with more urgency. It was like he knew we were inside, waiting, like he was testing us, seeing how long we could hold out before we broke. Then suddenly the sound stopped. The handle went still and silence returned. But I knew this wasn't the end. I knew he was only giving us a false sense of security, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And then, as if reading my thoughts, a new sound echoed through the cabin. A sound that made my heart stop. Glass shattering. I rushed into the living room, rifle in hand, and saw the kitchen window smashed. Shards of glass were scattered across the floor. But what terrified me most was the absence. He was no longer outside. He was inside the cabin. I sprinted back to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. Cass looked at me, panic flooding her face. He's inside, isn't he?" I couldn't answer. I just gripped the rifle tighter, desperately searching for a solution that didn't exist. The truth was, there was no safe place anymore. We were at the end of the game, and whatever that thing was, it wasn't going to stop until it had us. The sound of shattered glass echoed in my mind as Cass and I sat in absolute silence in the bedroom. Fear loomed over us like an invisible shadow, and each second dragged on for an eternity. He was inside the cabin now, and there was nowhere for us to run. The rifle in my hands felt heavy, useless. I was prepared to face a normal intruder, someone who could be intimidated by a gun, someone bound by the rules of reality. But whatever was toying with us didn't follow those rules. It had slashed our tires, circled the house like a shadow, and now it was inside. Cass could barely breathe, her eyes fixed on the bedroom door. I stared at the door too, waiting for the inevitable. Time passed, but he didn't burst in. Instead, the sound started again. That same dragging, that same slow, deliberate movement, as if he was taunting us. I stood up slowly, trying to control my breathing, every muscle in my body tense. The sound seemed to get closer, then drift away. He was moving through the cabin like a predator, studying us, waiting for the right moment. And then, something new happened. The lights in the bedroom started flickering. At first, it was a quick, sharp flicker, but then the flashes grew longer, as if the power was deliberately being toyed with. I knew the cabin's electricity wasn't the best, but this felt intentional, like part of his game. Cass looked at me, terrified. "What's happening?" I had no answer. All I knew was that this wasn't just an electrical issue. He was playing with our minds, keeping us on edge, waiting for one of us to break. The silence returned for a moment, thick and suffocating. Then suddenly a new sound. Something was scratching the outside of the bedroom door, slow and deliberate, like he was just on the other side, waiting. I moved toward the door carefully, the rifle in my hands, and pressed my ear against it. That's when I heard it. A whisper. Low, soft, almost imperceptible, but it sent chills down my spine. "You can't escape. I'm always here." Each word carried an implicit threat, a certainty that no matter what we did, there was no way out. I backed away from the door slowly, my heart racing, and looked at Cass. She was pale as a ghost, her eyes wide with terror. "We need to leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, even though I was falling apart inside. "We have to get out of this cabin." "But how? The car is useless, and he's inside," she whispered, her voice trembling with desperation. I didn't have an immediate answer, but I knew staying here wasn't an option. "We'll try to run into the forest," We can't stay here and wait for him, or whatever it is. Cass hesitated for a moment, but she nodded. I knew the idea of fleeing into the dark woods was terrifying, but at that moment, anything seemed better than being trapped with him. I grabbed a flashlight and the rifle, and together we moved toward the bedroom door. The whispering had stopped, but the silence that followed was even more unnerving. I opened the door slowly, the creak of the hinges deafening in the stillness of the cabin. The living room was in disarray. The broken window allowed the cold night air to rush in, shards of glass scattered across the floor, and the oppressive feeling that something unseen was watching us. There was no sign of him, but we knew he was close. Every shadow seemed to shift with its own life. Every dark corner hid a lurking threat. "Let's go," I said, taking Cass's hand and pulling her toward the front door. We opened the door, and a blast of cold wind hit us. Outside, the darkness was complete, the trees swaying gently in the wind. The vulnerability we felt was almost paralyzing, but we had no choice but to move. We started running. I kept the rifle ready, the flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead, but it was hard to see anything. The forest felt like a maze, and the sensation of being followed was overwhelming. Every step I took, I expected to hear something behind us. A drag, a whisper, anything. And then it happened. The sound cut through the night. A scream, high-pitched, piercing, and utterly inhuman. Cass stopped in her tracks, covering her ears, her body trembling. I felt the fear surge through me too, but I knew this was it. This was the end. "Run!" I shouted, pulling Cass again, forcing our exhausted bodies to move faster. But the scream didn't stop. It seemed to echo through the forest, coming from every direction at once, as if the darkness itself was howling at us, hunting us, surrounding us. "He's following us," Cass cried, her eyes wide with panic, and I knew she was right. This wasn't just a warning scream. It was proof that he wasn't letting us go. We ran blindly, aimlessly, the sound of the scream chasing us. The forest floor was uneven, the trees seemed to close in on us, and the fear was suffocating. Finally, my legs gave out, exhaustion overwhelming me. We stopped for a moment, gasping for breath. I looked around, trying to figure out where we were, but everything looked the same, just darkness and trees. And then, in the heavy silence that followed, a final realization hit me. We would never escape him. He was everywhere, in every shadow, in every sound. He wasn't just a physical presence. He was something far bigger, far more terrifying. And in that moment, I knew it didn't matter how far we ran or how hard we fought. He would always be there, waiting, watching. The game wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun.